Hello, everyone. I want to first off just welcome all of you to the International Society for the Study of Rural Crimes third virtual webinar. We are so thrilled to have all of you in attendance. We're thrilled to have 4 fabulous speakers with us today who graciously took time out of their schedules to speak with us. My name is Dr. Jessica Peterson. I am an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska in Kearney. Today we are going to have these speakers talk to us about community policing and crime reduction in rural communities. But specifically, we've asked them to identify a key element to successful community policing in their communities. We've asked them to outline a way in which they've been able to successfully engage the community in crime reduction efforts. And also they will describe one of the most significant challenges to reducing crime in rural communities. So just to give you a brief kind of overview, the entire session will last between 75 minutes and 90 minutes. We encourage you all to utilize the question and answer box. So you feel free to drop your question in there at any point throughout the webinar. We will be keeping an eye on that. And once all the speakers have had a chance to speak, we'll open the Q&A session. So I will basically at that point give all the panelists a chance to answer questions in the order in which we've received them. So please feel free to use that box throughout. We also just want to let everyone know that we are using the hashtag Issrc 2021. If you're interested in live tweeting during this event, feel free to use that hashtag. But without further ado, I want to introduce you briefly to our 4 speakers. So our first speaker that we are going to have is actually Deputy Chief. So this is a new thing that I can announce for her. But this is Deputy Chief Farica Prince. She's got 20 years plus of experience in law enforcement. Our second speaker that we will hear from is Chief Rob Davis. He began his career in 1990 and has served in several towns, Indigenous communities throughout Canada. The third speaker that we will hear from is Chief Jim Davis. I work with Chief Jim Davis. He's currently the Director of Law Enforcement Services here at the University of Nebraska, Kearney. And then finally, we will hear from Mark Prosser. And he is a retired law enforcement officer with lots of experience in the field, and he is currently based out of Iowa. So we will go ahead and start with Deputy Chief Prince. So feel free to take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica and Brian, for having me here today and for the announcement of my change in role from inspector with Blood Tribe Police Service to Deputy Chief of Prince Albert Police Service. So it's been a little bit of a journey these last few months, and made the decision to move on to a different and new exciting challenge. So I start with Prince Albert Police Service in Northern Saskatchewan on October 1. Yeah, I really appreciate the invite today. And the reason I think it's important to have the representation of Indigenous policing is because I feel like there's not a lot of awareness of the issues and challenges that the first people of Canada face on a daily basis, and specifically in public safety. I can speak to that because, like you said, Jessica, I've been in the game here 20 years. I actually just celebrated, or I'm going to be celebrating my 20th year here in a couple of weeks. So that's pretty exciting too. So I appreciate that. There's been some topics or some questions that were posed for us to address for the viewers today. And first off, I'll talk about the key elements to the success of community policing for the Blood Tribe Police Service. The key element to success for our community engagement was building trust. So we can go right back to the historical relationship, like the beginning of the historical relationship between Indigenous people of Canada and contact, which is 500 years ago. So the non-traditional style of security and policing for Indigenous peoples was not the colonial institute that we know now as policing. So if you can imagine, being an Indigenous person, growing up in your home community, and then, engaging with the local police service, becoming a police officer in your home community, and the challenges of wearing that uniform that represents the crown, represents colonialism, represents a lot of difficult circumstances that were put upon us, our ancestors, and created for us. So building trust with the community of Kearney, or the community of Blood Tribe, has been integral to the success of Blood Tribe Police Service. If you can think back to President Abraham Lincoln, or even Prime Minister of Canada John A. Macdonald, they both of those very significant leaders in North America had very specific agendas to harm the Indigenous people. And police officers, even to this day, still represent those specific agendas. We look back on the history of police here in Canada and exactly what they had a part of. What they were responsible for doing, which was enforcing children into residential schools, enforcing children and families to be split up during the 60s scoop. And even more recently, we can look at the missing and murdered Indigenous woman crisis. We can look at the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in incarceration. A fact is that Indigenous women are the fastest growing population of incarcerated people here in Canada. And we only represent just over 4% of the population, but our representation in jails is remarkable. And the justice system, including police, have a big part of that. So it was quite interesting and unfortunate and eye-opening, raising awareness when the events began unfolding after George Floyd died. And the different treatment of racially or ethnically diverse people has been happening for years, but I believe that George Floyd's death caused or helped a lot of people understand and see and become aware of the actual realities of the interactions between police and people of color, including Indigenous people. So I think that public safety in general, leaders are taking steps to make changes. And we're seeing that with increased accountability, transparency, representation of diverse people within police services, and focusing on oversight. So those are how we make corrections moving forward, for sure. One of the biggest things for Blood Tribe Police Service that we did to engage the community to start building that trust was in 2018. We held very significant time, significant engagement with different community groups and held consultation sessions. And this was, professionally facilitated. We wanted to make sure everybody had their voice. The questions were asked: what's working? What's not working? What do you need from your police service? What do you want to see from us? There was a lot of meaningful dialogue. There was, again, significant time and effort put into these community consultations. And, you know, it was really eye-opening to see where our police service was failing. And it became clear that we had to focus on building trust, and because it wasn't there for many years. You know, our police service has been operating for over 30 years, and the lack of trust was very like astonishing. So the efforts made to build that trust and all of that dialogue that happened resulted in an organizational shift and a change in priorities, so much so that the vision, the mission, and the values of the police service completely changed, and the direction changed. So this allowed, again, through that community consultation, allowed members of the community to let the police know directly exactly what they wanted, how they wanted to be policed, and, you know, where we were falling down, and, you know, where we were doing good. So this did a few things for the community and for the police service. The members of the community were able to take ownership of the organization. You know, these community consultations and this new strategic planning created a lot of pride within the community for the police service. And, you know, the result of that, you know, increase in trust, confidence, and support. And with that trust, confidence, and support, we're seeing, you know, an increase in reporting of crimes, an increase in informal resolution, like through diversion programs, which is really important right now, especially when we're seeing the over-criminalization of Indigenous people. So, you know, it was a difficult decision to take such a large chunk of time out of our day-to-day activities, which is, you know, responding to crime, to make sure that we were sitting and having this meaningful dialogue. But the results were transformative for the organization and the community. So we're seeing, even to this day, an overwhelming amount of support for our organization and the initiatives, and those are mostly driven from community feedback and like through consultation. So, you know, that was a big step that Blood Tribe Police Service did in order to build that trust that was definitely missing. You know, what are one of the challenges that Blood Tribe Police Service faces currently in reducing crime or attempting to reduce crime is, you know, simply just being who we are. So, you know, I believe it's difficult for people who have maybe low levels of compassion or empathy to imagine what it's like to live your entire life being marginalized, being forgotten about, being invisible. And, you know, as marginalized people, as a marginalized community, organization, you know, we all have access to limited resources. We all have funding that is significantly less than our counterparts in municipal organizations or communities. The awareness around our issues is significantly less. I feel like it's improving, but historically it's been significantly less. And, you know, the bottom line is, you know, we're 500 years into contact, and we're still vulnerable. We're still healing the traumas of the last 500 years when we look at residential school, the 60 scoop, and then the current crisis. So all of that unhealed trauma in our communities results in, you know, a very vulnerable community in terms of the symptoms related to unhealed trauma. And in specific, for us, is addictions. And in 2015, our local leadership declared a state of emergency because of an opioid crisis that we're still battling right now. And when we look at community wellness and community health, that's definitely the I guess, the foundation of what all of the public services, social services are working towards in the community. And I mean, things are improving, you know, one initiative at a time, one family at a time, one person at a time. But I feel like we have a long way to go. And it's, you know, it's going to take a very large group of supporters and believers in community health and wellness to deal with this unhealed trauma and the symptoms that come along with that. And, you know, there's been many police leaders before saying, we can't arrest our way out of poverty. We can't arrest our way out of addictions, out of trauma. And that's simply the bottom line. And any way that the police, Blood Tribe Police Service has been able to support the other services, we've definitely been doing that for, you know, the last number of years, and we've seen quite an improvement in collaboration and circumstance. So yeah, Jessica, that's and Brian, those are the points that I would like to share.
Thank you so much, Deputy Chief Prince. We appreciate that. Our next speaker that we'll hear from is Chief Rob Davis. We have two Davises with us today, Rob Davis and Jim Davis, but Rob is going to speak next. So Rob, when you're ready, go ahead.
Thanks, Jessica. Depending on where you are in the world, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's my honor and privilege to be here. And so there's going to be a lot of overlap with what Farica touched on. Over half of my career, I'm in my 31st year of policing. I started very young. I was a teenager, and I started with a municipal service that did a series of small towns in a very rural, sprawling area. And so those towns ranged from 2,000 people to the largest being around 12,000 people. And I was one of the very few Indigenous people in policing in that police service and in Ontario at that time. And at that same time, there was a movement to create self-administered Indigenous police services. In 1990, we had a significant event, the Oka crisis, and out of that, you saw a federal commitment to see self-administered Indigenous police services be created, of which my home community, Six Nations of the Grand River, was one of the pioneers in becoming self-administered. One of the challenges was, though, finding Indigenous applicants to come home to police. There weren't many of us. And so my first real policing job was with the Six Nations Police Service, serving my home community. And so I was in this fascinating position where I was one of a handful bringing experience from the outside to a brand new police service that was literally starting from scratch. We were starting from scratch. So I was bringing lessons that were learned in those small communities, rural settings, to our reserve, which is the largest reserve in Canada based on population, but is rather rural in how it's configured and laid out. But what was also interesting, and especially now where we sit in the context of North America in wake of George Floyd and a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and rallies, as well as the defund the police movement, Six Nations Police was created because the community wanted something different. They had been policed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police from the 1800s up until 1972. After that, the Ontario Provincial Police took over policing duties. And in both scenarios, after being policed by both agencies, the community was very clear that they wanted something different. And so as a result of that, the Six Nations Police were created. And like I said, we were created from scratch. And I look back now, we were created because the community called for something different. And where we sit today, communities are calling for something different. So I really believe that a lot of the lessons we've learned in Indigenous policing, whether it be Six Nations Police, Blood Tribe, our brothers and sisters in the Manitoba First Nations Police Service, formerly Dakota Ojibwe, Akwesasne, Treaty 3, we were all created because our communities wanted something different. I'm the first Indigenous officer in Canada to ever lead a non-Indigenous police service. And so what I have done is I have taken those lessons from Indigenous policing in the community wanting something different and tried to apply them into the agencies I've led since I left Six Nations Police. And so, the first question was, what's the key element to successful community policing in your community? And I think, Farica obviously touched on it. It's that trust. But my initial service, Six Nations, we were created because the community wanted something different. And it was sort of a running joke on growing up on the reserve, is the federal or provincial government would always be showing up and we're the government, we're here to help. And yeah, we're here to help. And there was very little consultation. And so the lesson I learned from my time in Six Nations Police, when I moved into transition to municipal, is finding out what the community genuinely wants. We need their buy-in, we need their trust, but it can't be the police driving this. We need to have genuine consultation with the community to see what the community wants, what are the community's expectations. And during my time in policing, I've seen this evolution where, 31 years ago, the solution was to throw more cops at everything, put an extra police officer on every corner, beef up this, beef up that. That's not sustainable. And so the last 20 years of my career, that's been a very constant conversation, is the sustainability of policing, and especially transitioning from Indigenous policing to municipal policing, where we are tax-based. You have the competing demands of public safety, but there also is such a thing as tax fatigue. And now you throw in dynamics such as the pandemic, where you're having an impact at federal and provincial and municipal levels. It is straining the taxpayer, and so there is such a thing. And so what I've done in the communities I've policed is taking that lesson of finding out, genuinely engaging the community to find out what do they want, but then also to see what's their acceptance. What are they willing to try? Let's do something new and different, because the last 200 years of policing, we haven't changed. Like, policing is so slow to change in Canada. And so that's the critical part, is finding out, getting that trust through real consultation, finding what the community wants, their expectations, but also testing their tolerance for something different. Which segues into the second question of tonight, was outline one of the ways or initiatives in which you have successfully engaged the community in crime reduction efforts. And so this isn't so much the practical solutions on the street. This is more as building that foundational piece. And where I got to do it on a smaller scale when I was chief in Dryden, Ontario, a very small community, but around 10,000 people in northwestern Ontario, where your nearest big city is 4 hours away, east or west. And other than that, you are in the middle of the north. You're surrounded by lakes and trees and beautiful country, but you're in a very small town in a very rural setting. So I tried it on a smaller scale of that consultation, but where I really got to really test it was when I was in Lethbridge, Alberta, and it was through partnering with one of our local post-secondary institutions, Lethbridge College. And I went to the college. Well, first I went to the police board and I said, this whole police telling the community what the solution, I don't buy into that. That's not how I work. So let's see what the community wants. I'm alive to such a thing as tax fatigue. I clearly believe we do not need a cop on every corner. There has to be alternate models out there, or ultimate deployment models rather. And let's test what the citizens are willing to take. But I also have noticed throughout my career that when the police drive these types of surveys and consultations, there's always a segment that are critical of us that, well, you're marking your own scorecard. So, you can consult all you want. In advance what the end result's going to be, or at least that's a perception. So we partnered with Lethbridge College. Dr. Farron Ellis was amazing. And I sat down with Farron and I said, here's what I want to do. The typical community safety survey, I could take one from Vancouver, from Saskatchewan, any city in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Alberta. They all generally say the same thing. I want to go beyond that. I want to know what's the community want? Like we tested all the things about safety, crime, but then we also built in, what's your willingness? What's your willingness for new deployment models? And we talked about something in Alberta, it's called a community peace officer. In Ontario, we call it a special constable, where it's an officer that has training, but they're not a full-fledged officer. They have very specific duties. They can be assigned to very specific geographic areas. They're financially more affordable. And then what I liked about them is they became a testing ground for people that were on the fence, coming from Six Nations. Not a lot of people were lining up to be police officers in 1990. And so this was an opportunity through the special constables. There's an opportunity to test the waters if it is a career. So we did that, and we talked about volunteerism. And so one of the things we want to know is, okay, community, we've heard you. Now, what's your willingness to be part of the solution? Everyone can, everyone has an opinion. Everyone has lots to say. What's your willingness to be part of that solution? It was beautiful. Dr. Ellis had a research lab. He would always use his students, second and third year students, to go and do that. And we were blown away with the return rate. We were over 20% return rate, which we were stoked about because previous years had been less than 10. So we had this very significant return rate. It actually, they had to cut it off. They had to cut it off just because it would have kept going. So it had to stay manageable. We had over 20% return rate. And with that, we then had a foundation as to what the community was willing to, what they wanted. And it was very interesting because the typical police lens was, we put all these police beliefs onto the citizenry, that, they want a cop on every corner. And it wasn't that. A lot of it was, I just want to know that somebody's coming. I don't care who. It was fascinating that a lot of the public, we get hung up on our rank structures. The public didn't care. We get hung up on titles, whether it's a constable or a special constable or an auxiliary constable or a community volunteer. And we have a number of programs in Canada for volunteers. The community did not care about those titles. The police were hung up on it, but the community, all they wanted was, I want to know that somebody is out there, that when I call, someone will respond, and that response is commensurate with what the crime is. I don't need a 10-year veteran at the top of the salary band showing up to a stolen garden hose, but I want to report this stuff and I want to know somebody is taking it serious. So those are all eye-opening for us, very eye-opening. And then the willingness to be community volunteers, that was the best part. Resounding, yes, if there's an opportunity to volunteer, count me in. So we had, in my opinion, that was the perfect recipe. We knew what the community wanted. We knew what their threshold for trying new ideas and new deployment models were. And then the biggie was their willingness to be involved. And so with that, we were able to roll out a stratified approach to public safety, to deter crime, to address crime, and address those perceptions of crime in the community. And again, it started with volunteers. We had a hybrid of volunteers / summer students that were enrolled in post-secondary. So they volunteered throughout the school year, but they were guaranteed a summer job. We had the CPOs in Ontario, special constables. And then from there, we also, we had the regular constables, but allowed us to deploy commensurate to the type of crime. But there was a fascinating byproduct is we created pathways for a career for people from diverse communities who would typically not trust the police. That quickly built a buzz in the community, in the diverse communities, about our willingness to work with diverse communities. And then that had that cascading effect where it was almost, I always compare it to pro sports. You started at one league, you went up to the next league. In Canada, it'd be the hockey. So I had my WHL, I had my AHL, and I had my NHL. And it became a feeder league, but it also became a place for people to try to demonstrate their skills. And the other part of that is I used it as recruiting, just like pro sports, where I was very hands-on and had my team very hands-on recruiting. So we were going into the diverse communities that would typically not work with the police or liaise with the police or trust the police to show that, hey, we're in this together. The third part is what's the most significant challenge or barrier? And this is, I could talk for 3 days on this, but if I had to encapsulate it into one phrase, it'll be old attitudes. And when I say old attitudes, a lot of those old attitudes are still within policing, that we've deployed the same way for 100 years. We can't change. The fact is we have to change. We're not sustainable the way we've deployed for the last 100 years. The community is willing. It's clear that there's a willingness from the community to have different models, but it's those old attitudes. But the other side of it is I see in the political realm, This is my third police chief job. I've been a chief for a decade now with 3 agencies, just over a decade. And in all of them, I was hired to be the change agent, bring new, fresh ideas. And the minute you start rolling out the new, fresh ideas, there's always that political, like, whoa, slow down, chief. I want to see a cop respond to this. And it's frustrating because I was hired to bring new deployment models. And then, the minute there's a hot button issue that really is a social issue, whether it be homelessness, whether it be drug addiction, you name it, there's this reversion back to, I want a cop there and I want to see someone dragged out in cuffs. Well, as Farica touched on, I'm one of the chiefs that believe we cannot arrest our way out of these social situations. So that old attitude. And then the other part of it will be with some of the citizens as well, that some citizens, they want something different until they're the victim of the crime. And then, I've had it where they don't, they want the municipal police service there, they want the federal police service involved. And so that's where I have to encapsulate it into one phrase is what's the biggest challenge is old attitudes. The minute we have progress, old attitudes inevitably get in the way inside the police service, with the political leadership, and with the public. And so I will wrap up there in the name of time, and I'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief Davis. We are going to now move on to Chief Jim Davis. And this is a little bit of a shift. So now we're talking about Nebraska here. So Chief Davis, I will let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, first of all, I could sit here all evening and listen to the other areas. It's just been fantastic. I want to thank the committee for allowing me to speak. My name is Jim Davis. I've been in law enforcement for 37 years, and I've had the opportunity to be on the streets, be an investigator, been a sheriff, and now I'm probably going to wrap up my career as a police chief here at the University of Nebraska, Kearney Police Department. And Brian, do I just say click, or do we go to the next slide, or? Yeah, no, there we go. Okay, first of all, talking about policing key elements, and I have to agree with the first 2 speakers on this. What I would like to do is go even a little bit further back into time, and what we're dealing with now, we really need to look at what Sir Robert Peel was doing back in England, and when he was talking about what the police department really does. And there are 2 major components with policing in the community, and that's developing community partnerships and engaging in problem solving. I don't think that anybody would probably argue with that. The question is, how do we do that? And to recognize always that the test of police efficiency isn't always in the number of tickets that I write or the number of tickets and people that my officers take to jail, but it's basically the absence of crime. Are we working with our community, and are we making this crime go away? Are people calling us? Are people relying on us that we will be around the corner when they call us to show up? We also have to keep in mind, and I agree with Chief Davis, that some of the old attitudes have to go. I mean, and I have told my people time in and time again that I never want to hear anybody say, well, that's always been the way that we've done it. We always should be looking at pressing forward and doing new things and listening to the public, because the police are the public and the public are the police. Also been asked to talk about reduction efforts. We do a lot of classes here on the university, and the university is a little bit different because I have new people coming in every year. And what we're doing is we're pulling these people in from different areas. I can have kids from Chicago here. I can have kids from Montreal here. I can have kids from San Jose here. And it's making sure that we as police officers are transparent to them, that we offer classes. We have a Citizens Academy. Chief Davis kind of talked about that as far as his different areas of training. We even talk about, all right, you're on a college campus. What's going to happen if we have an active shooter? Where do we go? What do we do? We also teach those. We also have education on house parties, see something, send something, or say something. All of those things and efforts that go into this. We have to remember that we were doing really good. When I first started in the 80s, we were doing really good. We were doing this community service and community policing really good here in the States. And all of a sudden 9/11 came. And we had kind of a 9/12 was a good time for us, unfortunately. But everybody looked to us as we were people who could get things done during a crisis. But then we kind of let that slip into an area where we became more of a militaristic leaders in the country, and that didn't set well with people. And if you remember, the first slide I talked about is we have to listen to what the people want. And so now we're trying to make up ground. I think both the previous speakers had talked about George Floyd. When something like that happened and you've already have lost ground, it's not a good thing to try to gain that ground back. So here, just in our little pocket of a community, we try to be so transparent and work with our students here on campus. Next slide. This is my biggest challenge, and it's a big challenge for me because when these students come in, they're almost like our kids on campus, and I think Dr. Peterson can verify that we are really, we hold these people near and dear to us. And when we have people from different backgrounds and they've already have experienced negative police contacts from home, and they arrive at different times during the year, and we have international students that come in who are used to the police are well, to get out of jail, I got to come up with this kind of money, and I have to, it is so different in different sectors of the world for them to have a contact with the police, that it is so important for us to be so transparent, sit down with them in small groups and talk to them. So those are our challenges. And I would really like to hear from anybody later on in the Q&A who have different ideas as to visit with different backgrounds of people who come together into a small group and how we can visit with them. That's pretty much, without reiterating what other things have been said today, that's my presentation for this. And I look forward to some questions and answers afterwards. So thank you, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you, Chief Davis. We have one more speaker. Mr. Mark Prosser is going to speak with us a little bit. I mentioned this before, but he's got also extensive experience in law enforcement here in the United States. So go ahead, Mr. Prosser.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I do a little bit about myself. I bring just shy of 41 years of experience in law enforcement, starting out in a larger jurisdiction in the metropolitan St. Louis area, and then moving to a rural community in Northwest Iowa as their police chief, where I served just a little over 30 years as the police chief and the public safety director in the community of Storm Lake, Iowa. And Storm Lake is kind of on the map, certainly in Iowa and in different parts of the country, as being an example community of rapid change, and how communities adapt to quick shifts in demographics, and then how do they provide services. So if I could get the next slide, please. So in the realm of that, we had to learn early on some real key elements on successful community policing, and there's many definitions of community policing out there. I quite often use the one that is the principle of the community taking ownership in their police department and the police department taking ownership in their community. And what we learned right away is we just have to do business different. And we've heard some wonderful guidance and comments about how law enforcement needs to evolve, how we need to change. And that certainly was the case in our community that was moving from, it was experiencing growth. It was experiencing an increase in language barriers and certainly cultural differences, to the point now today where Storm Lake is the most diverse community percentage per population in the entire state of Iowa. Its community school system is over 90% non-Caucasian. There's somewhere between 25 and 30 languages spoken in a community of 14,000. So you can see that impact and the need to adapt on how to serve this rapidly changing community. And what we learned is it's all about, as we've heard, creating relationships. But we also have to understand that creating relationships and the success of creating relationships just isn't about going out and talking to people. It's about creating that mindset and philosophy within your own organization, which is also time consuming. It requires training, it requires patience, it requires good recruitment and just walking that walk every day. And it's top down, but it requires everybody to be a part of it. And that is always an ongoing process. But we look, and in our community, in jurisdiction, we needed to create new types of relationships and new styles of communication, because we had so many people from so many different parts of the world speaking so many different dialects. And here we were in rural Northwest Iowa, unattached to any urban center, with really limited resources. We kind of had to create a process through trial and error of reaching out and serving everybody that called Storm Lake home or who came there for work or to play. And so we worked on, with success and with failure, a variety of different outreach and relationship related programs. Understand that it is a never-ending, perpetual process. And I often, as my career moved forward and started speaking in other jurisdictions that were changing, kind of, what have you done? What have you learned? What have you failed at? What have you succeeded at? I always had to remind individuals and leaders that this isn't about a one-time effort. It's not about one event, one meeting, one festival. It has to be a mindset, and it has to be a way of life for all of your officers, all of your public safety folks, and truthfully, all of your government employees across every discipline, to understand that we all have to be in the business of creating relationships. And I often refer to folks that think about your own private and personal lives. Think about your marriage, the relationship with your children or grandchildren or your parents, office relationships. That is a work in progress every day. And in each one of those relationships, we make mistakes, we have bumps in the road, we learn more, we apologize, and we move forward in trying to create a strong relationship. And that's the same mindset and the same reality that law enforcement agencies have or should have with the communities they serve, that it's always a work in progress, and it's always an effort to continue to build relationships and build bridges. The other thing we learned in seeing our community change into a very diverse jurisdiction is that people from different parts of just our country, urban versus rural, but most certainly from different parts of the world, they do business than what the traditional white, conservative Northwest Iowa business person did or do. They're not going to go quite often to city council meetings. They're not going to go to large forums to voice a concern or to speak up about wrongs that have occurred or needs that they may have in the community. They're not going to come to the police department, and they're not going to come to the police chief's office. We learned with time that we have to take our show on the road and go to them and build relationships, one person, one family, one block, one apartment complex, one neighborhood at a time. And so that's how we started to develop programming as time went on. We also knew we had to be transparent. If we made a mistake, If we did something wrong, if we were heavy-handed, if we made, we made misunderstandings because of cultural differences, we had to admit that and continue to say, you know, what we need to learn, as everybody needs to learn, and we're going to do better. And we certainly, as an organization, had to evolve with different types of officers. We, you know, I was great to hear the different types of specialized officers in Canada and not necessarily sworn officers. We used the same concept, called them community service officers, but added that they were bilingual and help us bridge language gaps within our community. You have to be out there and not only understand and have your finger on the pulse of a changing community, but be prepared to change your organization, or at least your processes and policies in such a way that you can adapt to them. You have to educate yourself. Next slide, please. One of the ways we did that, of course, we've all talked about outreach and making relationships and so on. And we kind of indoctrinated that into everything we did, whether it was school programs or education programs and so on. We never missed an opportunity to go meet with any group when we were invited. We made it a priority, even when there were some tough conversations. And the other thing that we did was enhance that by creating one of the programs we did was neighborhood outreach, where we took our police officers, joined by our firefighters, other community advocates, and we would roll into a neighborhood, a parking lot, a park, wherever that might be, once a week, once every other week. It doesn't work in the wintertime, as many of us know, but throughout the summer and warm months, for the mere purpose of creating relationship, providing information, providing services. We were not there for a call for service. We were not there for a crisis or an emergency. We were there to go door to door, introduce ourselves, and to create those relationships. And we have done it there, I'm retired. The new chief does it with great and wonderful grace, continuing to do that. But it was all about understanding that our safest communities are those where there's a good partnership between citizen and public safety. And it was to help enhance and create those partnerships. And I will tell you, in the early years, and we did the traditional things when we rolled in, turned on the lights, had handouts, candy, and so on. In the early years of this process, it was pretty much the kids running out and getting the candy and the pencils and the frisbees and the footballs and so on. But with time, as their parents and the elders of their neighborhood saw that we were coming back, we weren't there for enforcement, we were there to help and be advocates on their behalf in a variety of different platforms. And all of a sudden, the adults started to come out and join us at these events every week. And then they started to voice their concerns about the speeding motorist, the street light out. I'm not happy with snow removal, right up to there might be a house with suspicious activity. And that's how those relationships have formed and continue to evolve through these types of programming. And the important thing is, because we talked about, and we heard earlier about budgets and fiscal responsibility, and in smaller agencies, they have challenges just like our large urban counterparts. Budget and how we spend that budget is an issue. But these types of programs are designed around using on-duty personnel and partners and community advocates, where it's not an impact on the budget and not a drain on overtime, having to bring extra people in and things like that to do this week in and week out. So we try to address those issues. And with time, all of a sudden the community started to step up and see what we were doing, and the donations started to come in of materials we could share and so on, or just money that we could buy things for the children and so on. And that program has evolved today to where the current department, we talked about the militarization a few minutes ago of law enforcement. Well, we acquired a Humvee through a military surplus program, and the current chief took that military vehicle, and through donations, he's got an ice cream machine in the back of it, and it's called a Yumvee now. And it travels the city giving ice cream out, again, for one reason, to create those relationships, to show the human side of law enforcement, and to get to know and understand the people that the law enforcement agencies serve. So those are the types of things we do. This is one type of program that we use that helped with outreach and as an initiative. But what we have to understand, and I constantly shout about this and remind folks, is that it doesn't end with one event. It has to be a mindset. It has to be a way of doing business. It has to be perpetual in nature, and it pays dividends. And if I could just go to the last slide, then to talk about significant challenges, and we all have them. Most certainly, one of the challenges is knowing your audience, knowing your community when it's rapidly changing, when there are cultural barriers, when there are language barriers. It's about bringing folks in to train your staff. It's about going out in the field to learn and hear the stories of the challenges that so many of our neighbors have in that community, and to educate yourself. The real challenge is language barriers, especially in rural America or rural Iowa. How many qualified interpreters can you find in dealing with so many different languages to appropriately interpret or translate materials so that you are ensuring that their civil rights are being honored and that you are providing the services that they're requesting? So language barriers when you're dealing with shifting demographics, it is a significant challenge in building relationship, in building trust, and that translates into making your communities safer. Cultural differences. It's our responsibility in law enforcement to know our citizens and to know where they've come from and what they've experienced. We had folks coming from areas of the country, or I should say the world, where their experience with law enforcement is that the police officer was the officer, the jailer, the judge, and in some cases, the executioner, and also came from areas and regions where corruption was rampant in public safety. We have to understand it. We have to educate ourselves so that we can, again, go out there and build bridges to say, hey, we're here for you. We're not that way. We're here to serve you. You have to understand also in our case, fear of immigration related issues. I'm a strong proponent that local law enforcement should not be involved in immigration enforcement. And we had a lot of folks that were undocumented, or they had visas expire, they were refugees, they had family members that maybe have documentation issues, and they were just afraid. And when you're afraid, you go into the shadows. And when you go into the shadows, you don't report criminal activity and you become targets to be victims yourself. We went out and we continue to go out, and I continue in my retirement to advocate for immigration reform, immigrant rights, and to create that clear difference that the federal government is involved in hopefully appropriate immigration enforcement. Local law enforcement is there to serve anybody and everybody who lives, works, and plays in that community so that they can build that trust. So often what we experience in these diverse jurisdictions is the debate and the ongoing conversations at a national level impacting the psyche and the stress and the distress on the community people that local law enforcement serve, and it pushes them into the shadows. And then lastly, with individuals moving from urban centers to rural centers throughout our country for a variety of reasons, I often refer to that urban philosophy, moving to rural Iowa or rural America, and bringing with it a different way also of doing business and expectations for law enforcement. And that's another challenge and a barrier that local law enforcement, especially in rural America, needs to learn and work through. So I think I'll stop there and turn it back over. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I would invite at this time all of the panelists to go ahead and turn their cameras back on. We have some good questions going in the Q&A, so I'll start with some of those. So we have one question that's addressed to all of the speakers. Chris Jordan says, I am from New South Wales Police in Australia. We have an issue with recruitment and retention of police officers in rural New South Wales. And so the question is, how have you overcome these issues and the methods, and what are the methods that you've used to overcome recruitment and retention of police in rural areas. I'd also add to that any kind of added challenges with recruiting and retaining from diverse populations. Anyone who wants to jump in, go for it.
In our experience in Northwest Iowa, the same issues and challenges exist. Across the board nationally, those individuals in the United States that are interested in public safety, whether it be police, fire, or EMS, those numbers have gone down and actually started going down pre 9/11 and pre some of the issues we've experienced in the 2000s. What we're seeing is a smaller base of employees, but individuals that are much more focused or intent on making law enforcement or public safety a career, as opposed to a larger pool of individuals just out applying for jobs per se. It is, we're seeing agencies doing different types of incentive packages, whether it's providing incentives for college education or even signing bonuses, those sorts of things, depending on the experience of individuals coming into their organization. So there's that entire marketing and recruitment type of approach that you see in a lot of different disciplines that are currently searching for employees. But the other thing is, in our case, we really focused on looking for good communicators, people who are articulate, a lot more interested in people who can write good reports and show compassion than I am about somebody who's a good shot, those types of things. So we started focusing on those. In our community in Storm Lake, there was such a rapid change in our diversity with many different ethnic groups moving in and calling it home. We struggled and continue to struggle, although they have made great strides after my retirement on having our workforce mirror the community and have a more diverse workforce. Some of that was generational. We were dealing with first and second generations that had challenges with language, that had challenges with understanding state mandated tests, things like that, but we're moving beyond that, and they're having much more success in providing a diverse workforce. So the challenge is there, and it's real throughout our country, whether you're in an urban setting or a rural setting.
Yeah, I would just like to echo some of Mark's comments, but I'd like to drill it down to something super basic that I've talked about at a provincial and national level here in Canada. And it's all about finding the people who want to be there, finding the people who care about the community, who aren't worrying about the next transfer out, about the next opportunity, about the next unit, or it's about finding people who want to be there and invest in public safety in that community. And I honestly believe that with some of the smaller communities within Canada that are policed by our federal organization, the RCMP staffing model, the way that RCMP members are deployed is actually quite harmful to communities. So when you have police officers who have the mindset of, I only need to be here 2 to 4 years, then, I mean, we have to look at, I'm not saying that they're bad people, not at all. I'm just saying that when you're not invested in the community and the community's wellness, then, that's going to show up in reflection of, the engagement and the commitment. So I truly believe that finding people who want to be there is the key.
If I can just add an additional comment, and it's drawing upon my observations and experience at Six Nations Police. The credit on this goes to retired Chief Glenn Lickers, who was our first chief. He had been an RCMP member, but he was from the community, left to the RCMP for a number of years, and then came back to lead us. But he recognized at that point, there weren't a lot of people looking to join policing for a number of issues, the historical relationship with the police and the Indigenous community, but also it was a rural, very blue collar. Our reserve was very, it's famous for iron workers, structural steel workers. a very blue collar town. And yes, we now boast a lot of academics, but at that time. And so what we did as an organization under Chief Licker's leadership is, and I hate bringing it back to this pro sports analogy, but Glenn's philosophy was, let's get the youth engaged now to see the police as friends. And so it was through a program out of the US, the Police Athletic League for Students. And the typical sports you saw in our community were hockey, lacrosse. That was it. Somebody to play soccer, you get laughed at. To go skiing was unheard of. All these, you name a sport that was outside of hockey and lacrosse, maybe football. There wasn't a lot of range, and some baseball. And so it was this Police Athletic League for Students where we developed the trust, the friendship. Fast forward a decade, those kids that were 7, 8, 9, 10 were now becoming summer students, going to post-secondary for criminology or different programs, coming back as summer students, and then winding up becoming full-fledged officers or civilian members after they graduated. And now I sit here, so where I am today in Brantford, I'm right next door to Six Nations. I talk to the new chief, Darren Matura, all the time, and they're in a great situation where they're having to turn people away. Indigenous officers who came from the community and other Indigenous communities that are wanting to come there, plus non-Indigenous members that just want to be part of it. They want to be part of this unique area in Ontario. And so I think that if you're willing, it takes time though. It'll pay off in the long run, but having the patience to develop those trusts and friendships and relationships in the early ages to make policing a viable career from a young age.
And I would have to echo what Chief Davis said was you also get a chance to watch these people grow up, and you get a chance to kind of handpick who you would like to have on your team. And that's a big plus. One of the things that we watch and we are very attentive to is a lot of our younger people who want to get into policing that either are on that 20, 21-year-old boundary, they will go into corrections. And either corrections or communications. And that's another good area to watch and get in there. Nobody says that you can't do recruiting. Get in there and recruit these kids, talk to them, visit with them. They'll come aboard. And I'll tell you, the best piece of advice I can tell you is to get these kids out there and ride with you. Just take them for a ride and show them what it's like and show them what you actually do.
Thank you. We've got, like I said, we've got several good questions coming in. I've got a couple people who've asked some questions about funding and transparency within that. So I'm going to kind of combine a couple questions here. But we have one individual who worked for Vancouver Ports Police and was talking about open allocation of funding for police on coastal bands. So there's kind of a dual question here. One, for neighborhood engagement, how someone asks, how do these things get funded? What is the funding model that's effective? And along with that, is there transparency on funding that you get that does come from a government entity?
Well, I'm going to come right out of the gate, and where I work at, most of the funding comes out of our officers' pockets. So we really don't have much to go on as far as funding. So I'm going to turn it over to the other three.
I would say that on some of our outreach efforts, we don't need a lot of funding. I mean, you can do it with your resources and your on-duty people as we have developed different programming, especially if we're sharing items or giving items out. We have found that local businesses and corporations have donated money, and we maintain accounts for donations for public relations and outreach and stuff, all of which is totally transparent and all of which is funneled through the auditing system of the cities and so on. Beyond that, our normal operational budget picks up the same, and it's public record and talked about by the city council and vetted in that fashion. But for the most part, for the creative work, and let me back up, one other funding source is seized criminal assets. If we seize assets in a criminal investigation, we do our best to either turn those assets over into other investigation equipment, or community outreach. And again, those are all run through auditing systems and very, very much transparent.
And then just coming from Indigenous policing, I talked earlier about, being marginalized, being underfunded, lack of access to resource. And same goes for this. If we're creating a task force or a special unit to combat or engage in something specific, it's always about balancing competing priorities. And we have to MacGyver anything we do, because we have limited resources. We have significantly less money than our policing partners. So, I can't really make any comments about the transparency of it, but, making the decision to pull boots from the ground into a specific unit to engage or combat is all about balancing competing priorities. And that's why I believe in agile strategic plans, because things change. And I think COVID taught us that. All of our 5-year strategic plan priorities went out the window as soon as the pandemic hit. So, you find yourself in an opioid crisis, you find yourself maybe in a suicide crisis, and, the priorities have to change, and it's about balancing. And sometimes things get left behind, but, these are all new. The taxpayer dollars and municipal funding agreements are going to be new for me and in my new role, but looking forward to learning about it.
And if I can just add a comment, I was taught many years ago by a mentor of mine, ask those community partners, and when the chiefs talked about getting out there, that engagement is constant. So when I pitch, different deployment models or different ideas of how we can serve the community, I'm everywhere. I'm talking in front of Rotary, I'm talking in front of the Lions, I'm talking in front of different community groups, and everywhere I'll slip into that. Here's the dream. An example is one of the programs we were looking for an ATV, all-terrain vehicle, like the Gator style, so that we could actually put lights on it to flip up and turn it into a crime prevention through environmental design vehicle. But I just planted the seed as the dream would be this. Bang! Within 2 weeks, the phone's ringing off the hook. People saying, "What do you want? We'll buy it for you. We'll give it to the police organization." And so the takeaway I've learned is don't be afraid to ask. And I know some law enforcement agencies are hinky to do that, but the community partners, if they share the vision, my experience has been is by sharing that dream consistently, that people will step up and support you.
Thank you. This next question is actually for you, Rob. Someone asked, Janet Sievers asks, how easy was it or not to develop new models within an institution? And when you went out and tried to engage the community in these new models, how did you measure their tolerance for them? And how did you measure the success of those models after the fact?
So the most success was in Lethbridge. Again, it was a partnership with Lethbridge College, Dr. Farron Ellis. And so before we ever engaged the community, we determined what's going to be the survey, and what's going to be the survey that goes out the following year, the year after, so we can measure the success. And so that was critical, is identifying the questions. We were going to ask the community about their tolerance for new models. In that survey, we put a description of what some of the new ideas were, the new deployment model entailed. And then we had the question that was going to be used as the follow-up questionnaire for the next 4 years. And so that was the measurement piece. And again, by using that objective academic, it really helped, because it gave it almost a validity that would have been absent if the police did it ourselves. There would have been the cynics out there. And so that was a big part. As far as the development wasn't the hard part. It was the implementation. And we've heard it here a couple of times, and I mentioned it's just that old mindset that, oh, chief, we've always done it this way. Oh, sorry, that's not sustainable. And to hear that inside was frustrating. The community were supportive. the politicians were supportive. And so where the biggest resistance was just from some inside. And right now, as I speak, I'm trying to implement some things in my current role. And the resistance tends to be inside because we call them associations. In the Canadian context, they're similar to a union. And just, that wanting to cling on to the past because, we're taking away jobs, but we're not. What we're doing is actually allowing our officers to focus on what they're trained for and bringing in other personnel with different skill sets to address the things that we shouldn't be going to in the first place. So there's been challenges, but what I found, my guiding document was that initial survey that Dr. Ellis did with the public, with the return rate we had. I went to bed every night and slept like a baby in that regard anyway, that we were doing what was best for the community, what the community wanted, and it was a big, small town. And so when I would walk down the street, I walked to work every day when I was there. When I would get the seniors stopping me, thanking me, because my tax bill, there is such a thing as tax fatigue. And when they thanked me and they saw the visibility of the different officers and volunteers out there, that's what made it, that was another measure of success. But having that initial document and survey result, that allowed myself and the leadership team and the political entities to realize we got to stay the course. And I guess that's the other thing I just want to touch on. For any of you that are aspiring to go into leadership in police agencies, is my observation has been police, we try something, and if we don't see instant results in 3 months, 6 months, we want to abandon it. And so if you have a plan, stick to the plan, have the measurables there so that you can see if you're making a difference.
Thank you, Chief Davis. One of the other questions we have from Kyle is, what are the challenges of policing rural areas from a personal perspective? And related to that, how do you manage the process of policing community members that you know very well in a rural area?
One of the hardships, I guess you would say, that hit me when I first started policing is you get to know these people and they become part of you. And even the guys and gals you take to jail still become part of you. And when you have to go to that fatality accident or you have to let a loved one know that somebody has passed, it's not like working a metro area where it was, well, we've got to do this and it's gone. It's a piece of you that has gone and you have to grieve that. And it can be tough at times, but it's part of policing a very close-knit community. Didn't mean to bring everybody down.
I was going to say, would anyone else like to add to that, or do you want?
Yeah,
Rob?
if I could just add exactly what the chief said. It becomes part of you, but I also found that you could leverage that. When I think of when I was policing in smaller rural communities, and even now where I'm at, it's a glorified, it's a big small town. If you jump headfirst into that and embrace it, I think of the bar fights I've been to over the years and all the things where I needed backup, that in a large municipal setting, you would have had 12 officers show up. Well, that wasn't an option in my earlier services, but because I had those genuine friendships and trust in the community, even people like the chief said that I had taken to jail, when they saw that I was there to do my job for the right reasons, they had my back. And so that genuine investment in the community made it rewarding. And I actually felt safer in those environments than I have in some urban environments.
That's a really good point. And when I first heard the question, I was approaching it more from a leadership perspective. And, I feel like we have done a really good job at preparing, our applicants and our new recruits to have to police people that they went to school with, played hockey with, played, sports with, or our family with. We've done a lot of preparation to, compartmentalize your job versus your relationship and just doing the right thing. But listening to Rob bring that up. That brings me back to being 19 years old, fresh out of depot, and showing up to a bloodbath of an aggravated assault by myself, and leveraging that relationship of of knowing people and having that relationship. And it's quite interesting. I don't know how many times I've written relationship building, relationship management during the session, because I mean, we're all talking about it, and I feel like that's the biggest takeaway here.
And I would just add, we hear, speaking about relationships and community policing, 20 or 30 years ago, that was a new term that seemed like it was something new and fancy for big cities. But it's how small rural agencies have done business for generations. And it's because of being able to rely on that person you knew and have that relationship with them. Community policing was created in rural law enforcement, not the other way around, because of the very things that we shared in answering this question.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have a question that's directed at Rob and Farica that is about asking about when it comes to Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations communities in rural areas and police recruitment. Did you have any issues where officers who were local returned to their communities and were actually then targeted by their community on or off duty? And if so, what methods have you used to try to protect those Indigenous officers that come into the community?
Not sure if you want to go first, Rob, but I'll just quickly share that I policed my home community for just almost 4 years, and then led an organization that tried very hard to hire local people to police the community for several years. And although we have a policy on protecting police officers in situations like this, I personally have never had to experience or deal with anybody local being targeted. I haven't had to experience it. I don't know if you have anything to contribute, Rob.
Unfortunately, when I was at Six Nations Police, we did have officers targeted. Vandalism to their vehicles. Worst case scenario, we had an officer's house that was burnt down. Officers had their houses shot at. So that did occur. But I think we all knew, policing our home community, that was a possibility. So there was a level of preparedness for it. What kept us focused was when the word would break that these events happened, the community would inevitably rally around the police. The tips would come in to solve the crimes. Off duty, I've experienced that where, and very rarely, it was the outlier event where somebody would want to cause an issue off duty. And again, because of those relationships in the community, never had to worry about it. Somebody would intervene and make sure it was dealt with. The person would be taken away. It never escalated. Very rarely would you see it escalate, because the community, we had those genuine friendships. And that's, like I said, even people that we had arrested in the past would say, like, hold on, they're off duty, leave them be. Come on, we'll play pool or something. And so those interventions occurred. But I think there was an inherent understanding on the front end. This is a real possibility. We knew we were doing something different. We knew we were in our own community. We knew there would be these challenges, but we accepted that. And because we also knew the alternative was revert back to the OPP or the RCMP. And so we knew we were there to be something different, and with that would come some challenges, and we were going to stand up to that.
Thank you. One question that's kind of a combination is, what advice would any of you give to new recruits who are coming into a rural area? And what advice would you give to them on how they can best come to understand the needs and expectations of the citizens in their communities?
I often reminded recruits that people that you see when you're on patrol or answering calls, they're good people. Cops tend to become suspicious and you know, what's this person up to? What is that person up to? But the reality is 99% of the folks we serve and that we live with are good people. So don't get yourself in that rut. The second thing I always tell recruits is don't have your circle of friends be cops. Expand it. Have other people in the community, a wider social circle, because again, if just your circle, your social circle are the people you work with, you tend to dig ravines and crawl down in there sometimes and fester with problems or the stress of the job. Make sure your high school chums and your neighbors, those are your best friends, so you can continually see the reality of the communities you serve, that most people are good.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chime in on that one, or we good to move on? Good to move on. Okay. I have another question that, and several of you mentioned major events that have to do with law enforcement. Specifically, many of you mentioned George Floyd. And one of the questions was, in relation to public perception and cooperation in rural spaces, do you find that residents are only vocal as a reaction to these major law enforcement related events, or are they open to generally sharing thoughts regardless, right? Not just as a reaction to some of these major events that we see?
Well, I think the major events are sure in the back of their mind, that they have those things going on because of it. I mean, you can't get away from it. Most of the people, however, are really concerned about what's going on in their lives, and they want to talk to you about that. And they want to come to you, and if you have played your cards right, steal a page out of Rob's. If you're playing the game right, then they're coming to you with their problems and they want to talk to you about what's going on in their life, and they're not so much affected by what's going on in the national scene. At least that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a good point. I mean, anytime that there's an event, there's always going to be, you know, the outlier who is there just to contribute to chaos, you know, or use the platform to drive their own agenda. I mean, we see that all the time. But I do believe that, you know, Black Lives Matter, the movement of Black Lives Matter has created a safe space for people to speak up. You know, the rallies, the protests have created so much awareness, the media coverage, which sometimes is good, sometimes is bad. But I feel like the community of believing in what is right and what is wrong has created a sense of safety to speak up. And you know, we could say that maybe they're only speaking up because, you know, now that it's just a reaction to it. But you know, if you think about discrimination in any form, many people stay silent even when they witness it, when they experience it. And you know, in 2021 and moving forward, we should all be trying to create safe spaces for people to you know, stand up for what's right.
I think you're going to hear from individuals when these large events happen. If you haven't created a relationship with them already, that will be their springboard to say something. But if your organization has done due diligence in ongoing relationship building, community policing, where you have created opportunities to converse in different environments and so on, then it's going to be a lot more like, what are your thoughts about this? Or what is your take on this? As opposed to accusatory finger pointing towards the profession. And so I think what we've seen in a variety of cases in the United States following questionable uses of force or just flat criminal uses of force on the part of law enforcement are a whole lot of cities that have been able to manage the conversations and manage the stress and the anger because they have existing relationships. Where you tend to see the violence and the burning and the real riots break out in many cases is where they have lacked any efforts in advance of creating that community policing model and that relationship. And that in itself should be an example and a sign to law enforcement agencies everywhere that you don't wait for a crisis to create a relationship. You create a relationship in order to manage a crisis.
Thank you so much for that. We have a few questions that unfortunately I'm not quite able to get to because I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. We're almost to the end. So I do want to say a few words. First of all, thank you to our panelists. We are very appreciative for you taking time out for us today. I want to thank all of the attendees for coming. And I also want to give a shout out to a couple Issrc members, Tara Hodgkinson, Rick Ruddle, and Brian Farrell. Of course, he's running the tech for us today. But myself and these other three individuals all helped put this together and organize it. So thank you all for your help with that as well. One last note for anyone in attendance who is interested in studying rural justice, rural crime, etc. We would love to have you join the Issrc. We are a group of practitioners and scholars who have some of the same interests at heart. You can join on our website, which I do believe we might have a slide for, Brian, if you wouldn't mind pulling up that conclusion slide. We also have a Twitter that we're quite active on. So if you want to keep up with all things rural that are going on, feel free to follow us on there. And then just on a final note, this recording will be up on our website. So if you are interested in looking at any of our previous roundtables or some of our upcoming roundtables, again, feel free to check out our website. Otherwise, I appreciate all of you for being here, and we hope to see you at one of our next roundtables. So thank you.